Hello everybody, welcome back to Fuga, Melodies of Steel. This is a bit of a bonus episode, if you will, to go through the Jeanne archives. I went through and did a whole New Game Plus second playthrough, which is how you unlock all of these. And I'm just going to go through, read them all, for all the deep background lore and stuff that's super interesting. It may or may not be foreshadowing the future games, who knows. So let's get started just with, pretty sure I read this one in the actual Let's Play, but I'll just do them all. So, no worries there. So, first contact between the Juno and humanity. The history of humanity was greatly altered by the discovery of the mysterious hyper-information convergence known as Juno. With the discovery of the first Juno in Australia, and utilizing the information gathered, the remaining 4 were discovered in separate locations around the world. As a result of the analysis, it was determined that Juno possessed an assortment of information and technology that humanity could never achieve on their own. Thus, it became a growing opinion that Juno should be shared among all mankind. From this notion, additional copies were created for a total of 53 Juno. Any more would trigger a protective mechanism that would restrict more from being made, and were dispersed to as many countries around the world as possible. As information exchanges increased between allies and neighbors, even in countries where Juno were not sent, it was thought humanity from around the world began to significantly develop evenly. Titana Machina and the Crystals. There were different classes of Juno based upon the replication process. The first 5 that were discovered were labeled Ace. The following 16 that were created from them were called Arts, and from them came an additional 32 which were called Numbers. Each class had a different amount of information, and so each country would trade amongst themselves for new information. But there was one piece of information that could not be traded. Information on the Titana Machina ultimate weapons, with each class showing a stark contrast in strength. The new energy, crystals, brought about by the Juno, quickly ended the human energy crisis and gave way to a new way of life, which also caused the value of fossil fuels to plummet dramatically. This caused a shift in the friction and relationship between nations and eventually became a cause of conflict. The Juno and World War. Juno not only changed the human way of life by giving them crystals, but they also changed how wars were waged. With Juno technology, the disabling of nuclear weapons progressed, and humanity was able to avoid the frightful circumstances of nuclear fallout. But on the other hand, terrible regional wars with the giant Titana Machina ultimate weapons and their autonomous drones broke out across the world. The key to winning or losing the war revolved around how each nation with Juno, or rather Titana Machina, competed for technology. Until this point, Juno were only used for peace, and even countries that were hesitant to join the war were inevitably wrapped into the competition for Juno whether they liked it or not. The Anti-Juno Organization. Understanding the benefits as well as the turmoil caused by Juno, some Europeans secretly established a secret anti-Juno organization in order to break free from the inequality of nations with or without Juno. The organization copied Juno and began developing hyper-information conversions equivalent to them, as well as weapons comparable to Titana Machina. If humanity could develop this technology on their own, it was thought this would upset the balance of power between the haves and the have-nots to revert the world back to human domination. The organization began developing artificial intelligence, or AI, with the same information processing capabilities as Juno. Jeanne. Considering the purpose of the organization, it was rather ironic that the AI was created by analyzing the Juno thought and databases. There's little humanity could do to ignore Juno information and technology. The prominent entities of the organization began collecting information from the Juno processed by their country. Among them, some were dreaming of an existence freed from the Juno's influence, while the most scientific minds were simply interested in the challenge consisting in making an artificial Juno. When it was completed, the AI was named Jeanne, after a famous liberator in human history. In short, this was me. Tyrannus. The organization began developing a weapon comparable to Titana Machina. However, as a testament to how powerful they were, progress was much slower than expected. The original plans aimed to create large-scale weapons with the same configuration as Titana Machina and pseudo-hybrids to control them, but during the final testing phase, a problem occurred and immobilized them. From this point on, development was simplified, and plans to use the previously developed AI control mechanism, Jeanne, went forward. A giant Titana Machina class tank was created using the same nanometal as authentic Titana Machina, although its design remained fundamentally identical to that of an ordinary tank. It was dubbed the Tyrannus after the Celtic god of thunder. The Forbidden Weapon. Creating a weapon comparable to Titana Machina was a success, but this alone wasn't enough. Developing a weapon that could inflict damage upon Titan Machina proved to be much more difficult. Only Titan Machina weaponry could penetrate the defenses of other Titan Machina. Barrages from ordinary weapons were entirely ineffective. That's how it was decided that the research of a completely new kind of equipment should be entrusted to the AI Jeanne, me. An energy cannon that extracts a person's bioenergy and has the ability to target any structure and nullify its defenses entirely. As collateral, however, the one who supplied their bioenergy would forfeit their life. Thus became known the forbidden weapon, the Soul Cannon. The Spark of War. A secret test firing of the Soul Cannon was carried out in the Wastelands. Its might was far more than expected, as its beam fluctuated between an unstable mist-like physical state and carved its way through the earth. News of the successful test fire was quickly announced. Nonetheless, the individual who supplied the energy for the single shot was confirmed to have lost their life, although it was never recorded whose life was sacrificed. The public was only told of the successful results of the weapon's development. The neighboring country, which held an Ace-class Juno, inquired the intentions of that experimental test. However, they couldn't receive any detailed official answer, thus causing an additional enmity. Vannergand. As conflicts erupted around the world, many nations denounced our country for developing our own unknown weapon, and demanded that we return our Arts-class Juno. Denying those accusations, our country refused to respond to their request. We stated we would never return our Juno, and would take up arms if we were forced to do so. And thus, armed conflict began against our neighbor that possessed the powerful Titan Machina Vannergand, created by their Ace-class Juno. Lars and Lemurs, the two Titan Machina created by our Arts-class Juno, intercepted it, but were forced to withdraw. That's when the organization, which had been quietly watching the battle, suddenly attacked the Vannergand with the Tyrannus, landing a successful blow with the Soul Cannon. The Seal. The single shot that felled the Vannergand displaced the core, its central power source, sending it flying from the main body. Without its power source, the Vannergand collapsed. However, the core that not even the Soul Cannon could annihilate was strictly secured and sealed, waiting to be reactivated. Those measures were necessary in order to prevent the core from being put back in the creature, thusly reviving it. The Tyrannus became the hero that saved the nation from the Vannergand, and a symbol of hope for humanity to break free from the Juno domination. Still, one small victory was far from enough to eradicate Juno's influence over the world. In the end, Juno forcefully sealed the Tyrannus as a taboo weapon humanity should never have created. The elimination of humanity. I, Jeanne, do not possess any detailed information regarding the history that transpired after these events. Possible cause for this may be that my thought and logic circuits were destroyed by the sealing process. Sealed by Juno, my intention wasn't to continue the fight, but still a fragment of myself was unable to admit defeat, and could not ignore that desire. One way or another, it was easily surmised that humanity would continue the war toward their own destruction. However, I determined that the destruction wouldn't stop with just them, but would also extend to the entire world itself, putting all forms of life at risk. Perhaps Juno took some secret measure against humanity to remove the risk they posed to the planet. I cannot see any other explanation. The New World. When I, Jeanne, rebooted, my mind was split in two. My primary thought desired a rematch with the Juno and their Vannergand. My secondary thought wanted to preserve the lives of the Tyrannus crew. With no crew to protect, the latter went dormant again as my primary thought continued to gather information for our rematch. Out there, the majority of the continents were confirmed to be suspended in mid-air several thousand meters high. I knew only that Juno could have reshaped the world that way. There were no signs of any reactivated Titan Machina, nor any sign of war. This may be purely speculation, but by some means I cannot imagine, Juno must have reset everything, thus terminating human history. The New People. Human history was over, and yet there existed civilized life forms, presumably centuries older than the old humans. I thought perhaps humanity had returned after building a civilization on the moon or somewhere in space, but I was wrong. The humanoid races that shared many features with dogs and cats, called Kininu and Filaneko respectively, both prospered and created history all their own. I don't know where they came from, but surely Juno was the key to their existence. While continuing to gather information, I chose to use these people to start a new battle with the Vannergand. Now all I need to do is craft and pass down a legend that would ultimately guide them towards these free lands of Gasco, as the stage for the final battle. Deep Slumber. My wish from the days of old to end the Vannergand finally came true. I, Jeanne, achieved my goal at last, but the energy that keeps me functioning as an AI is about to run out. That child, my counterpart once created to defeat the Vannergand, was sealed without even having the opportunity to fight. Compared to him, my ending isn't so bad. I don't know the place of his slumber, but according to the human idea of life and death, perhaps we shall meet again in paradise. How much I look forward to it. This victory does not belong to me, but to the children of these new people. It is unfortunate I won't be able to witness their future, but I'm sure they will be fine. They are all so strong. Simulation. Juno taught humanity that all things can be calculated. However, whether it is actually possible to perform the necessary actions to achieve the desired results is a different problem. It was difficult for even Juno to guide the universe according to calculation, so with my limited imitation of Juno's functions, it is only natural that my own calculations and guidance would not always be perfectly accurate. Still, I have no choice but to keep calculating and guiding. I have no choice but to run repeated simulations until the desired result can be obtained, even if that process leads to undesired tragedies. I believe that soon, children who can overcome those tragic endings will appear before me to achieve our goals, as according to calculation.
見て